Okay, welcome everyone to our webinar on carbon literacy, a first step in responding to the climate crisis. Today we are joined by Dr. Rachel Dunk, a principal lecturer in environmental management and sustainable development. Of course, I need to remember to turn my camera on. And sustainable development at Manchester Metropolitan University and a certified carbon literacy consultant. Rachel's teaching and research interests encompass the science and policy of carbon, energy, and waste management. And she has extended experience in carbon management training and advisory services across the public, private, and third sectors. Most recently, Rachel has led the development of a carbon literacy toolkit for the higher and further education sectors within a project funded by the UK Department of Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy to develop carbon literacy toolkits for the public sector. Today, Rachel will share her experience of developing and delivering certified carbon literacy training, both internally at Manchester Met and for external audiences. This will include the what's, why's, who's, and how's of carbon literacy, an overview of Manchester Met's award-winning training, and a summary of participant outcomes, before considering some of the challenges in rolling out carbon literacy training at scale. As always, there will be the chance for questions at the end of the presentation. So throughout, please do feel free to submit them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. At the end of the session, I will then ask those questions on your behalf. So please do feel free to use that at your will. So thank you again so much for coming today, and I will hand over to Rachel.
Hi, I am there. It's just taking me a few moments to find the buttons. Here we go. So thank you everyone for coming along. It looks like attendance is very good today. So as Kat said, I'm going to be talking to you about carbon literacy as a first step in responding to the climate crisis. This work is not just mine. I particularly want to name check my colleague Jane Mork, who's been a partner in both developing and delivering our training over the last 6 to 7 years. So an overview of my talk today, quite a bit on why carbon literacy, a little bit about what it actually is, and then the majority of the time on how we do it, the outcomes for our participants, and what we see as the major challenges facing us now. As Kat said, particularly in terms of delivering at the scale required. So why carbon literacy? I'm probably talking to a very knowledgeable audience, so forgive me if I'm teaching granny to suck eggs here, but the challenge in front of us is immense. The challenge of addressing dangerous climate change alongside nature loss are now widely recognised as the most significant challenges facing humankind. If we look at how much warming we've already experienced, this is the best estimate from the World Meteorological Office, puts us at 1.2 degrees of warming above temperatures in the period 1850 to 1900. So we've already experienced over a degree of warming. We know we have the Paris Agreement, which is both laudable and fraught with difficulties in delivering. So the Paris Agreement aims to hold the increase that we experience this century to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. Now, the mechanism through which that is made operational is through our nationally determined contributions. So each country is setting its own targets in order to deliver against the Paris goals, where those targets need to be equitable and ambitious. So each country needs to do its fair share, and ambition is about actually recognizing the scale of the transformational change required to meet these targets. Now, in the Paris Agreement, it's holding the temperature increase to well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5. And as I'm sure you're aware, we had the special report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on global warming of 1.5 degrees, which did a comparison of the risks and impacts at different levels of warming, particularly between that 2 degree and 1.5 degree target. And the clear conclusion from that report was that risks and impacts are significantly higher at 2 degrees than they are at 1.5 degrees. And the strap line, sorry, I've skipped ahead of myself there. if we think about what that means, if we want to deliver against the 1.5 degree target, then we need to be reaching net zero carbon dioxide by around the middle of the century. And this plot is a simplified version of a diagram that appears in the report. And it's showing the range of all the possible climate runs that are compatible with 1.5 degrees of warming. And we can see the very clear shape to this curve where we have to peak and then have a dramatic reduction in emissions over the next 10 to 15 years, reaching that net zero carbon somewhere around the middle of the century. And then indeed going into negative emissions, so actively removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the strap line from that report is every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice we make matters. So 2.5 degrees of warming is better than 3, 2 is better than 2.5, and 1.5 is better than 2. So in the UK, we can be very proud that we were the first country in the world to set a legally binding emissions reduction target. Originally, that set an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. That was recently revised to 100% reduction in all greenhouse gases by 2050. Now, that does go a little above and beyond the net zero carbon dioxide by mid-century target. By including all greenhouse gases. But the UK is a wealthy, highly developed nation with a large degree of historic responsibility for climate change. So it's questionable on whether that's actually doing our fair share under the Paris Agreement. And indeed, we have some very eminent scientists, one of whom is Professor Sir David King, so ex-chief scientific advisor for the UK and now a leading advocate on action on climate change. And they're calling for the UK to advance its climate targets now by 20 years, so bringing the date for cutting emissions of greenhouse gases to net zero from 2050 to 2030. Now, one of the key issues here is that it's not just the date that matters, it's actually how much we spend. So how many greenhouse gases do we emit into the atmosphere between now and then being forever. And this is the difference between a budget-based approach and a target-based approach. And in the UK, we're lucky in that the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research has done some of the hard work for us here, and the link is at the top of the slide if you want to go and have a look at that. But we have Paris-compatible carbon budgets for all local authorities in the UK. So the shape of the curve matters. So if we imagine this is what our emissions trajectory looks like between now and extending out over the 21st century, approaching near zero, it is the area under that line that gives the total emissions over time, so our budget. And this shape of the curve is the emissions allowance we have that is Paris compatible. And that means we need a sharp decline in emissions over the next 10 to 15 years. That's around 12 to 14% year-on-year emissions reductions. If instead we focus on we must be net zero by 2050 and we don't worry about the shape of the curve, then if we end up on a linear profile to achieving that, our emissions would be more than double that Paris compatible budget. So the area shown in grey here would be all the extra emissions over that time. So if this rectangle represented what we need to do, so that's our Paris compatible carbon budget, and then we stop and think about everything we already know how to do, and we assume we could implement them all to their maximum possible extent, then at the moment we don't know how to achieve our Paris compatible budget. So if we implemented everything that is theoretically possible, we would still be emitting more than we can afford to stay on track for our Paris goal. If we then actually factor in what's practically feasible to deliver on the ground, that box, certainly for Greater Manchester, where this analysis has been done, is more than twice the size of the Paris compatible carbon budget. So we have an immense challenge in front of us. So in addition to taking immediate action to reduce our emissions and get on that steep reduction curve, we also need significant investment in research, innovation, education, and engagement to close this gap down and make this Paris compatible carbon budget actually achievable. And that essentially is our why for why carbon literacy. Our emissions cuts that we need to make to prevent dangerous or indeed limit dangerous anthropogenic climate change are very challenging. And they are challenging on multiple levels, technologically, politically, and culturally. So understanding the scale of the problem and actually feeling empowered to take action is critical. And it's critical to drive changes in our own behaviours, which will make a big contribution to achieving net zero UK. But also increasing the acceptability of investment in and implementation of climate mitigation policies. So it's what are we going to do? What are we going to spend our money on and invest in to make sure that net zero remains achievable? And what are we going to allow to be done to us via other policy mechanisms? So the what of this is about embedding zero carbon thinking into our lifestyles and operations. We need to normalize this. We need to make it acceptable, a social norm for us to be taking action on climate change. And the how is, in terms of this talk, one possible how, the Carbon Literacy Project. So the Carbon Literacy Project was actually born out of initially Manchester City's Climate Change Action Plan back in 2012, where this need to develop a low or zero carbon culture was recognised as a second sort of headline target alongside the emissions reduction cuts. So I should say at this stage, I am not the Carbon Literacy Project. We partner with them, but the Carbon Literacy Project is actually a charity, a trust that promotes the understanding of climate change. And operationally, the Carbon Literacy Project is delivered on a day-to-day basis by Cooler Project's community interest company. So it is the Carbon Literacy Project that have set this definition and created a standard around what carbon literacy is. So by their definition, carbon literacy is an awareness of the carbon costs and impacts of everyday activities and the ability and motivation to reduce emissions on an individual, community and organisational basis. And the standard I have condensed into sort of 4 banner items here. So it covers the knowledge that needs to be gained, and that's around climate change, science and impacts, and around the ability to identify actions to reduce emissions. It must instill particular values or promote particular values around equity and fairness, present an aspirational vision of what a zero carbon world would look like, around individual agency, the power that we do have to change and the power that we have to influence others. So it very much encourages working with others. There is a requirement to pledge to taking an action, and that's both, there's 2 actions that you need to pledge in order to become certified. One is an individual action and one is specifically an action that involves working with others. And it also sets the learning approach that needs to be local or social learning and group-based inquiry, so participatory learning approaches. So within this, Manchester Met has been a key partner since the inception of the Carbon Literacy Project. And for us, our view as our role as a university is very much both to take that action to reduce our footprint, but also we're in a particularly strong position to influence others. And we view that as increasing our handprint. So this is around that closing the gap piece, both in terms of research and innovation, but also just as importantly, if not more so, around the education and awareness raising. So in terms of what we've been doing at Manchester Met, we do both carbon literacy training and we train others to be carbon literacy trainers. And that's actually where the balance of our attention has now shifted. We deliver that both internally to our students and staff, and we also deliver to external organisations. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the carbon literacy trainer here. So this is a Cascade training model. Internally, we recruit our own students and we train them to deliver carbon literacy. And there are massive drivers for this. First of all, it really adds to students' employability. They gain a formal qualification, they develop fantastic transferable skills, and they gain considerable work experience during their time with us at the university. And then from a practical perspective, it also gives us improved project viability and scope. So for a given staff resource, it means we can very significantly extend the scale of our carbon literacy delivery. And it offers a really meaningful route for extension to our wider community, for example, taking our student trainers into schools and colleges. And that's really well supported by our widening participation team as well. So if we look at the Cascade training model, in the same amount of time it would take a member of staff to train this many, the little green people there, to be carbon literate, we could train 10 trainers who could then go on to train significantly more people. And based on our experience to date internally with our students and the number of people they go on to train, we think this gives us a factor of 3 to 4 improvement in reach for a given staff resource. So this is now also the model we promote with external organisations, where if someone asks us to come and do carbon literacy training, we're very much trying to persuade them to allow us to facilitate an internal delivery programme by training internal members of staff to deliver carbon literacy. In terms of outcomes, we have consistently measured with our student training the immediate impact of attending the workshops by pre and post training surveys, where this analysis is then based on matched pairs. So simple Likert scale questions, where one is the I don't know very much about climate change, and green is I know a lot about climate change, or one is I'm not at all confident, and green is extremely confident. So the yellow is before the training and the green is the post training, and the numbers with the upward arrows are the individuals who showed an improvement when we look at those match pairs. So in terms of self-assessed knowledge on climate change, 74% report an improvement. In terms of confidence in identifying personal actions to reduce their carbon footprint, 83%. Confidence around identifying the carbon impact of future job role, 84%. And then we've got confidence in and likelihood of communicating on the bottom row. So confidence in talking to friends and family about climate change, 73%. Likelihood increase, 59%, a bit lower. And then confidence in talking about views and actions on climate change in a job interview, up at 70%. In terms of our student trainer outcomes, this sort of schematic is a summary of the key outcomes that have come out of focus group interviews with our student trainers. Overall, all of it translates to increased confidence. And then we sort of can group the benefits that the students identify into employability related and knowledge and action on climate change. In terms of the increased knowledge around climate change, they were identifying the more social side, so these cultural aspects to the change that's required, building skill and knowledge on how to pass their knowledge on to others. But it also really strongly influenced the degree of action that they were taking, in that they wanted to have authenticity when delivering training, and that gave them further motivation to take stronger actions on climate change themselves, and also to challenge poor behaviours in others rather than just letting them pass, obviously employing their enhanced excellent communication skills. On the employability side, the key thing really was giving them something that they were delighted to talk about in a job interview, and that actually also translated to increased confidence in even applying for jobs in the first place. So we've been doing this a long time, and we won a Green Gowns Award in 2019 in the Tomorrow's Employees category for our student program. And then when Bayes was sponsoring a project which is managed by the Carbon Literacy Project to develop public sector carbon literacy toolkits, we were invited to be the lead HEI. So we've now converted all of our training into a publicly available toolkit that you can access via the Carbon Literacy Project. And the Universities and Further Education Toolkit, Universities and Colleges Toolkit, has been adopted by the EAUC, so the Environmental Association of Universities and Colleges, the Association of Colleges and Students Organising for Sustainability UK, which is now a sister organisation to the Students' Union. So the Carbon Literacy for Universities and Colleges Toolkit can be delivered both online or face-to-face, or you can mix and match between them with some caveats, and it can be delivered to students, to academics, and to professional services. It's released under a Creative Commons license, and it's free to use for any university or college delivering certified carbon literacy training. That certification cost goes to the Carbon Literacy Project and helps fund their work. And they do great work on advocacy around taking action on climate change. So the toolkit is broken down into 5 modules, covering the science of climate change, exploring carbon footprints, exploring what a zero carbon world would look like, our influence in bringing that change about, and then taking action. What are we actually going to do? And it's a mixture of lots of different types of activities. So there's some self-study elements, there's some mini lectures, discussions, quizzes, and games. In the toolkit, we've released all the materials that are needed. So there are slides stacks, there are the accompanying resources that you either print or need to sort of post on online resources for your learners. And there are detailed trainer guides that give both an overview of how to run the activity and then provide the background supporting information. So where we've sourced the material from, where you can go and read more about it, and so on. We've got 2 complementary toolkits that are coming soon. We're piloting these at the moment, the online versions of these at the moment. So Carbon Literacy for University Leaders, which is a shortened version of the training, but actually requires our leaders to implement their actions before they can get certified, rather than just promise to do them. And then we are going to be releasing our the trainer program as a toolkit as well. And we're just finishing off the piloting of the online version of that at the moment with an internal audience and also with a large group from Chester University. So they'll be coming this summer, and it's also possible to adapt our toolkit for other audiences. We have done a longer webinar on this on behalf of the Carbon Literacy Project, so please contact them if you want a copy of that recording. This is just highlighting sort of which activities just stay exactly the same these days when we're delivering to external audiences, which ones will definitely be changed and which ones might be changed. So obviously in the red, you've got the introduction to the training that has to reflect what the particular organization or area or community group is seeking to achieve, and local impacts of climate change and social issues and so on. Then we have Climate Change, the Facts. We watched that fantastic David Attenborough documentary, and then there's a game around greenhouse effect and greenhouse gases, and they don't change. We have an international footprints and vulnerability game where that may get modified, particularly if you are, for example, when we've delivered training in Wales, we've replaced the UK's footprint with the footprint of Wales. Then we look at the average UK consumption footprint, and then we look at the footprint of food and travel, and we will bespoke elements of that so that the journeys are actually relevant to the geographical area that we're delivering the training in. Module 3, which looks at a zero carbon world, there's a quiz around the urgency of taking action, and that will be modified to, it takes you from the international through to the local climate change targets, so it will be modified around the local climate change targets. Postcards from the Future is imagining what that future world will look like, and that's followed up with some best practice examples, so they will be relevant to the organisation. In module 4, our wider influence. If you're not in a university or college, you have to completely replace the role of a university or college presentation with something that reflects the type of organisation where it's being delivered. In spheres of influence, we're looking at extending our influence beyond what we might immediately think of. And so for leaders, for example, we'll also bring in the levers of influence that they can pull. And the communicating climate change will look at the messaging that a particular organisation needs to get across. And then in module 5 on taking action, that will be completely bespoke, suitable to an audience that we are delivering to. How much we change depends on ensuring that the training meets both the requirements of the carbon literacy standard, so local and professional relevance, and that it's developed and delivered by peers. So we will do that bespoking process in a co-creation process, basically, with our client. That also helps to ensure that it absolutely meets the needs and objectives of the client. And we'll be thinking about the type of audience, so whether, for example, it's general staff training or focused on leaders. And if you are thinking of using our toolkit and adapting it, we would recommend engaging with the Carbon Literacy Project team early in your development process and run your ideas past them to get an in-principle check and identify and address any potential issues. So the last thing I am going to touch on is some training that we developed for Manchester City Council. This was actually before we released our toolkit. It was completely aligned with Manchester City Council's regional strategy, so Our Climate, Our City. Many of the games are the same as in the toolkit, but what I want to highlight here is a more recent change that we made, and it's a direction that we're starting to take our training. So the original training we used to watch before the flood, before the fantastic David Attenborough documentary came out. We had our international footprints and vulnerability game, the greenhouse gases, the consumption footprint, carbon footprint of everyday things, what our zero carbon world would look like. Then we had a section where we were looking at how taking action on climate addresses other challenges that Manchester is facing, then the spheres of influence and the focusing on taking action and the communication. But a critical thing that I think all of our attention is starting to turn to, and we need to be focusing on as strongly as reducing our emissions, is actually climate change adaptation. So Manchester is consistently experiencing floods, and obviously also being a large city, the urban heat island effect is a major concern as well. So a colleague of mine was involved in a project with many other partners called My Backyard, which was looking at the benefits of domestic gardens in Manchester. And it was a survey on how much green space exists in gardens, and it was combined with aerial images to get an updated estimate of garden green space. And that allowed an estimated evaluation of the contribution of gardens to cooling the city and absorbing rainfall. And there was a key finding from this, was that essentially the amount of green space in gardens was significantly lower than what had been assumed in the city level sort of planning. When they're looking at their green space strategy, largely because so many front gardens have been paved over and sort of patios put in rear gardens as well. So the amount of grey space in gardens is really significant. So when we looked at Manchester City Council's training, we revised it. We switched out Leonardo for Sir David, which won us half an hour. And we spent that half an hour on a climate change gardening exercise. And we did a Lego gardening activity. And well, it was a lot of fun. And one of the things I learned is you are never too old to play with Lego. It went down very well with all of our participants. So the outcomes from the council training, evaluated in the same way that we evaluated our student training, were similarly fantastic. And I'm running a bit behind time, so I'm not going to go through those in detail. The one thing I will highlight here is we did ask about communication frequency as well as likelihood. And in terms of communicating to colleagues, we saw 90% of respondents were saying that they would speak to colleagues about climate change more frequently. In terms of the Lego climate gardening, they told it was important, useful, practical, empowering, creative, and fun. And some of the text comments were highlighting that this is actually something I'm going to do. I'm going to take this away and I can actually do this at home. In terms of whether or not they'd recommend the training to others, we got 100% yes. And a lot of the free text comments were saying our leaders have to do this and it should be mandatory across the council. And the reason I'm highlighting that is I'm now at the end of the talk where the challenges that we think we're facing now. So from our own work, we believe that we've got the evidence base to show that carbon literacy training, or more broadly climate literacy training, when we're bringing in consideration of adaptation as well, is an effective mechanism for increasing knowledge and promised action on climate change. But major challenge one is delivery at scale. We've been at this now since 2012. We've been gradually increasing our capacity. But even with our Train the Trainer program, we have directly delivered training to over 2,500 people. And if you factor in the people our trainers have trained, then it's closer to 8,000. Well, if we just look at the population of Manchester Met, we're 33,000. If we look at the population of Greater Manchester, we're 2.5 million. So there is a significant scale up that is required there. Major challenge two is attendance and not preaching to the converted. If this is voluntary training, if this is sign up, if you're interested, you're getting the people who are already interested in taking action on climate change. So increasingly, we are looking to embed carbon literacy training at the university for our students within programs and for staff within departments and teams. Major challenge three is the perceived time cost. So the standard training has to be equivalent to a day's worth of learning. It can be broken down into smaller sections and so on. But consistently, one of the things that we get is, oh, I can't possibly come for a day. You want a whole day of my time. There's this mismatch between going, we're in an emergency, and the amount of time we're prepared to dedicate to learning what we need to do about this. Once we get people in the room for a day, we get, oh, we should spend a couple of days on this. This is, there's so much more we want to explore here. So that's a perennial issue. And we get the same with the leaders training, oh, half a day, we should have had a full day. If I'd said to you, I need a full day, you'd have said, I can't possibly. And major challenge four is it achieves nothing if there's no action. If all we're doing is getting a promise to take action and then that doesn't actually happen, we've not made any difference whatsoever. We have done follow-up surveys, and that does indicate that people are taking action, real action on climate change, but obviously there's a response bias there as well, in that it's likely the people who haven't taken action who are choosing not to respond to that follow-up survey. So that remains a bit of an unknown, and we are therefore looking again internally we're embedding that carbon literacy within a wider behavioural change and making sure that people have something they can stay engaged and involved with to maintain that motivation. For further background, we've got a Living Lab case study in a past issue of the Environmental Scientist. So you can find that on the IES website. And to request access to the toolkit and get on the mailing list, please do contact our colleague Chloe Andrews at the Carbon Literacy Project on the email address education@carbonliteracy.com. And that is all from me, and I hope I've left some time for questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was very, very interesting. So yeah, we have a couple questions already, so I'll just jump right in. The first one is, so you mentioned a bit about how it could be adapted for non-academic settings. Do you see a use for it as a public engagement tool? As the Cascade training model, for instance, seems an excellent way of establishing ambassadors throughout society.
Absolutely, absolutely. So for us and our current target, we want to get as many universities and colleges doing this as possible, because we think they're in a fantastic position to reach out to their wider community. We certainly do that and want to do more of that. So as I said, obviously our focus has been on those educational routes. So taking our university students to deliver to schools and colleges, for example, and actually also using it to bring college students to university for the day as well. And they actually do their training at the university. Our grand plans for that, that was going to be a major focus for us in the last year, 18 months. And obviously COVID has derailed that somewhat, and we refocused on making sure we translated everything to online delivery. But that is now, we're strategizing about how to maximize that at the moment. And it's one of the main reasons why we're shifting our attention to promoting the train the trainer, and that we'll be releasing that as a toolkit, because what we'd like to see universities do is train other trainers, and then you get this cascade. So we're also now, we don't know what on earth we'd call it, but we are looking to develop a train the trainer, so that we could potentially do mass days with university academics, with school teachers and so on how to deliver the train the trainer program. Yeah, so that's sort of where our thinking is going.
Great. So we had another question here. It says the Cascade model reminds me of the training model by Extinction Rebellion, which is also present at some universities. Not sure about Manchester. Are there any synergies there?
So I think we've been doing this since before Extinction Rebellion was formed. I know some of our students are actively involved with Extinction Rebellion, so you never know. That might have been how that got in there. It just makes sense, doesn't it? Oh, sorry, that's the BBC telling me there's news on my tablet. I do apologise. There's news. It just makes sense when you're trying to reach a wider audience to do it that way. There's it's not something any of us can afford to be precious about and go, this is mine and you can't share it. We need as many people as possible taking as much action as they can possibly take. And we think this is, one bit that can help contribute to getting us there.
Perfect. A really interesting question from Jessica. I will be an incoming master's student at the Newcastle University starting in September. How can I, as a student, introduce carbon literacy training into the university?
Okay, so that's a fantastic question. First thing I would do is check with Chloe and see if Newcastle University have signed up to the toolkit, and she'd potentially be able to make, if they have, make connections for you to those the relevant members of staff at the university who are already thinking about it. If you want to do that as a student, you've got multiple routes. Have a look at what Newcastle University has in terms of an environment or sustainability team. At different universities, they sit in different parts of the university structure, but they're very often in the estates and facilities management team. So have a look at what's going on, contact those staff, ask them, how do I get involved? How could I do this? Chloe can give you access to the toolkits, so you can start equipping yourself. We have just run an open train the trainer for universities. We will be doing another one in the autumn term, so once term starts for all of us again next year. So if you fancy going on a train the trainer to get equipped to then implement that at your own university, those opportunities will be there. And we've already shared our training with another sort of collaborative, which is called Speak Carbon, that are actually based in the Northeast. So Google them, Speak Carbon, or email me directly, which is r.dunk@mmu.ac.uk, and I can introduce you to one of my ex-students who's actually part of that collaborative as well. So they're looking to, they're mainly focusing on sort of Yorkshire and Humber at the moment, but they're the biggest group I'm aware of sort of heading towards the Northeast. I hope that helps. But do it, check out your students' union as well, and the clubs and societies that are there. There's very often an Extinction Rebellion group. There's very often a People and Planet group that are student societies. So you can sort of lobby for it there as well.
Great. The next question, is there a danger of teaching about climate change and the actions that can be taken without taking into account the life cycle of actions and products, i.e. electric cars causing damage to the environment from battery production and the vehicles having a shorter life? Are these considerations highlighted in the teaching, as future innovators would need to consider all aspects of the environment holistically?
So they're touched on in discussions, and like that consumption-based footprint, for example, we base that on Mike Berners-Lee's work. So that includes the embodied carbon, but for the transport component of it, as a specific example, it includes the embodied carbon of the vehicles. In terms of the potential solutions, there isn't time and space with everything that we have to cover in the training to really make that part of the presentations. So there are more things that we cover off as and when they come up in discussion. However, there is the ability to bespoke the training and, sort of stick on masterclass type things. So, for example, with my own students, we very much cover those things off, because if you're doing the carbon literacy training within a unit, you've got the time and space to go off and explore the particular things that are relevant to that. So those sorts of things can be raised with time for exploration after, if that sort of makes sense, or you embed it into much more detailed training. But I would be very careful about the thinking about your audience and overloading people with too much complex information in one day. There is an awful lot to get your head around to just get the basics. We have a tendency as academics to turn things into sage on the stage and get carried away with our own interests and enthusiasms. And that's not the purpose of carbon literacy training. It has to be your participants coming to those understandings and having the time to think about what they could do and what the implications of that might be, and raise the questions that they have. And then an opportunity for you as a trainer to correct and guide on any misunderstandings of our current knowledge and understanding.
Perfect. I know we're running a bit over time. I'm just going to take one last question and then we'll wrap things up. But hopefully we've kind of answered a bit of everyone else's questions, I think. So the last one is, which are the hardest parts of carbon literacy for people to learn in your experience?
I think the hardest thing is the the things that come up consistently that are surprising to people and I think upsetting to people, the scale of the impacts that are already being experienced around the world, the extent of change that we need to make. So this was all over the news this morning, but around this issue with flying, and you know, it's a well-known issue. You know, the people don't want to give up those freedoms, and there's some really interesting sort of psychology around destination choice and so on. And I was thinking, we seem to have an automatic assumption that a destination that's further away is better. You know, it's more exotic just because it's further away. So I think that messaging is difficult. The messaging around dietary change can be difficult, particularly in particular areas and communities. So it needs to be framed very carefully. And I think I'm just wittering now, but it's trying to make sure that we're not minimizing the scale of the challenge in front of us, or without paralyzing people through fear. Yeah, and building that, because you don't want to get to the, well, there's no point in us doing anything, isn't it? We're all doomed scenario. And that's a difficult balance, I think, to strike.
Well, perfect. Thank you again, Rachel, for that presentation. That was super informative, and thank you for answering all those questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to every single question to the attendees, but hopefully you still got a very good idea of carbon literacy. So that is it for us today. Thank you so much for logging in. I hope you found that beneficial and informative. Don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar in the IES CPD tool, which you can find in the members area of the website. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel. If you're watching the recording now on YouTube, please do subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit that notification bell for us. But yes, just once again, thank you so much, Rachel, for that presentation, and to everyone who came today. Thank you all for watching, and hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.